Good evening and welcome. Tonight we'll start reading this book, Remarkable Diaries, the world's greatest diaries, journals, notebooks, and letters. This book was donated to my channel by Heffley. Thank you so much for this wonderful book and for the kind message you sent along with it. I really appreciate it. And if you would like to donate a book to my channel, you can check out my Amazon wishlist down in the description box. So let's just dive right in. Remarkable Diaries. So we're going to read chapter 1 tonight, and these are all from before 1500. Very exciting. Chapter 1. Check that out. So cool. So we're going to start off in the age of pharaohs. This is circa 2562 BCE. It is ink on papyrus and it's in Egyptian. This is Mirror, ancient Egyptian official. About 4,500 years ago, an official of the Egyptian state involved in the building of the Great Pyramid at Giza wrote down a daily record of his working life. In 2013, this journal was discovered by a team of Egyptologists led by Pierre Tallet and Gregory Mauer, who were exploring the site of an ancient Egyptian port at Wadi al-Jarf on the Red Sea. Along with other documents from the same site, these are the oldest papyri with writing that have ever been found. The author of this journal is named Mirror and accorded the title of inspector. Nothing is known of him except what can be gleaned from the journal itself. Mirror was in charge of 200 workers transporting stone for the Great Pyramid, referred to in the journal as Akhet Khufu. Limestone blocks for the external facing of the pyramid, then approaching completion, were quarried at Tura on the east bank of the Nile. Mirror's task was to organize the transportation of these blocks by boat along the Nile River and purpose-built canals to the Giza construction site. The journal describes Mirror and his men engaged in constant activity, making 2 or 3 round trips between Tura and Giza every 10 days. Mirror reported to the pharaoh's half-brother and chief of works, Prince Ankaf, at an administrative center named as Roche Khufu. The journal covers the period from July to November in the 26th year of the reign of Pharaoh Khufu, possibly 2562 BCE. When it ends, Mirror disappears from history. The discovery of the journal at the port of Wadi al-Jarf suggests he may have been responsible for importing scarce metal ores and turquoise from across the Red Sea. Opening a small but clear window upon such a distant past, the document has been described as the most important Egyptian find of the 21st century. Let's read a section of it, and then we'll take a closer look at one of the papyri, apparently. So this is Papyrus B, section B4. Day 21. Inspector Mirror spends the day with his file loading a transport ship. Emu at Tura North sets sail from Tura in the afternoon. Day 22. Spends the night at Roche Khufu. In the morning sets sail from Roche Khufu, sails toward Akhet Khufu, spends the night at the chapels of Akhet Khufu. Day 23, the director of Hesse spends the day with his naval section of Roche Khufu. Very exciting stuff. I mean, it does sound pretty mundane, but pretty exciting, honestly. So this is what's left of an inscription of how the pyramids were built. It says down here, I can't really get it in frame, that each column describes a day, and it also says that This is pretty much all of this roll that has survived. Pretty much all that's left. It's pretty awesome. Let's see what's next. Slide this over. I'm going to move my water so that I don't bump into it anymore. I've been desperately trying to figure out how to fit this big book in frame for you. It's still not quite in. My tea's in the way. There we go. Just gonna... Here, I'm drinking Tension Tamer tea. It's so good. Let me move it to this side. Hopefully it doesn't spill. Okay. Here we go. And now my chair's squeaking. It's all wonderful. Let's read the next one. Letters from Imperial Rome. This is 97 to 1000 CE. It is a manuscript copy on parchment in 10 books, and it's in Roman. It's Pliny the Younger, senator and writer. Living from 61 to 113 CE, Gaius Plinius Caecilius Secundus, known as Pliny the Younger, was the adopted son of a famed writer and naturalist, Pliny the Elder. As a member of the cultured elite in the golden age of the Roman Empire, the younger Pliny was a friend of prominent figures such as the historian Tacitus and the biographer Suetonius. He rose to be an imperial advisor and administrator and was eventually appointed governor of the province of Bithynia Pontus on the Black Sea coast. Around 97 CE, he began writing a series of letters, the Epistulae. Although addressed to his friends, they were couched in a formal rhetorical style that was intended for the eyes of a wider public. 9 books composed of his letters were published between 100 and 109 CE. Sorry for my chair. As a provincial governor, Pliny also corresponded with Emperor Trajan. Now, I don't know how to pronounce the emperor's name. I've read it so many times in history books. Trajan. I like Trajan. Okay. Let me know if you know in the comments. These official letters, which were probably not meant for publication, appeared posthumously as the 10th book of the Epistulae. Pliny had, in effect, invented an open literary form that allowed him to cover a range of topics, criticizing the ill treatment of enslaved people, lauding the virtues of education, describing country gardens, commenting on senatorial debates and law cases, and drawing moral lessons from the behavior of his friends. His 2 most famous letters, addressed to Tacitus, recount his memories from the eruption of Vesuvius, which he witnessed as an 18-year-old and in which his adoptive father met his death. Once dismissed as fanciful, his account of the volcanic disaster, viewed from Mycenaeum on the other side of the Bay of Naples, is now considered scrupulously accurate. His letters to Trajan contain the earliest view of Christian practices written by an outsider. Taken together, the Epistulae convey a more intimate and detailed view of life in the higher echelons of Roman society than any other Latin texts. So this is I believe, what was it? This is the reproduction of it, right? The illuminated version. Very beautiful. And I believe this is the original. No, it says no original has survived. So this is another copy. But very, very neatly written. Let's read a quote from it. It says from Book 6, describing the eruption of Vesuvius. On the other side of the bay, the black, fearsome cloud of fiery vapor burst into long, twisting, zigzag flames and gaped asunder, the flames resembling lightning flashes. Then the ashes began to fall, but not thickly. I looked back, and a dense blackness was rolling up behind us, which spread itself over the ground and followed like a torrent. The blackness of night overtook us, not that of a moonless or cloudy night, but the blackness of pent-up places which never see the light. You could hear the wailing of women, the screams of little children. That's pretty terrifying, but very well written. Next we have Travels in China. This is from 838 to to 847 CE. It's ink on manuscript in 4 volumes, and it's in Japanese. It's by Enin, scholar monk. Enin, a Buddhist monk, was part of a diplomatic mission sent from Japan to the Tang court of China in 838 CE. There we go. Selected to study and collect the texts of the Tendai doctrine of Buddhism, Enin remained in China for more than 9 years, during which he meditated with Buddhist masters and learned the tenets and rituals of different schools of Buddhism. From 840 CE, he lived in Chang'an, the Chinese Tang capital, but in 847 CE, he was sent back to Japan as a result of the anti-Buddhist policies adopted by the new Tang Emperor Wuzong. On returning to his homeland, Enin completed a day-by-day account of his time in China, which he called Record of a Pilgrimage to China in Search of the Law. Not only was it the first Japanese travelogue, but it was also the first document about China written by a foreigner. Enin begins the diary by recalling the dangers of the sea voyage from Japan to China in a time when sailors did not use a compass. He was literally washed ashore in China. He observes everyday life there as he travels on foot and by boat along the Great Canal of China. Noting local customs and traditions, Enin comments on everything, from the varied landscapes he travels through to the state of the economy. Above all, he writes about monastic life and how Buddhism is practiced in China. Enin depicts it as an inclusive religion. He meets female pilgrims and describes an impressive festival where the monasteries prepared and opened their baths to the public. Although Enin doesn't reveal many of his personal thoughts, his diary is treasured today as a fascinating insight into the late Tang dynasty. Back in Japan, Enin became the chief abbot of the Anryakuji monastery on Mount Hiei near Kyoto and head of the Tendai sect of Buddhism in Japan. He was given the posthumous title Great Teacher of Compassionate Awareness and became an important spiritual figure in Japanese history. So here we can see it says there's 2 complete copies that survived. And let me see, read from top to bottom, a total of 70,000 Chinese characters. And let's see the little section here that it has. 6th moon, 28th day. We reached Yangqiao and saw the monks and nuns of the city being sent back to their places of origin with their heads wrapped up. The monasteries are to be destroyed, and their money, estates, and bells are being confiscated by the government. Recently, a document came on imperial command, saying that the bronze and iron Buddhas of the land were all to be smashed. Wow, intense. Next we have A Tale of Court Life. This is circa 1008 to 1010. It's ink on vellum, also in Japanese. This is Murasaki Shikibu, writer. In the early 11th century, I really can't get this. There we go. Okay. In the early 11th century, Murasaki Shikibu wrote The Tale of Genji, thought to be the world's first novel. Murasaki was a lady-in-waiting at the imperial court during the Heian period, when the capital was Heian-kyo, now known as Kyoto. Japanese culture, from literature and poetry to painting, was flourishing at this time. Empresses surrounded themselves with ladies-in-waiting who were adept at writing pieces that honored them. Murasaki wrote for the Empress Shoshi, one of 2 rival empresses at the court. She included scenes of court life, both in her novel and her private writings, which were later published as the Diary of Lady Murasaki. The diary is not a day-by-day account of Murasaki's life, but a series of sketches, only some of which are dated. It opens with the words, "As autumn advances, the Tsuchimikado mansion looks unutterably beautiful." Much of the diary describes the time during the Empress Shoshi's pregnancy and the subsequent birth of a male heir to the throne. Murasaki describes the intricacies of court rituals and the attire of her fellow ladies-in-waiting in great detail, with occasional touches of self-deprecating humor. My dress was in the very latest fashion, and it would perhaps have been better if a younger lady had worn it. Although the diary was written more than 1,000 years ago, Murasaki's candor makes it seem quite modern, especially when she is describing her own feelings, such as her loneliness after her husband's death. Able to be both subtle and damning, Murasaki also shares shrewd observations of the Empress's all-powerful father, the Lord Prime Minister Fujiwara no Michinaga, who she reveals was often drunk and abusive and something of a sexual predator. Talks a little bit more about him down here. He was kind of, check this out. Here's a little quote. Isn't that beautiful? But let's see what she said. I can see the garden from my room beside the entrance to the gallery. The air is misty. The dew is still on the leaves. The Lord Prime Minister is walking there. He breaks off a stalk of omenaishi, which is in full bloom by the south end of the bridge. He peeps in over my screen. His noble appearance embarrasses us, I am ashamed of my mourning, not yet made up face. He says, "Your poem on this. If you delay so much, the fun is gone." Interesting. It says only 4 segments of the original have survived. Really, really interesting. Let's move on to another really interesting one. A Godly Life. Circa 1438. Pen and ink on paper. 124 pages, and it's in English. It's Margery Kempe, Christian mystic. The medieval visionary Margery Kempe produced a fascinating day-to-day account of her religious and personal life. Written in Middle English, the common language spoken at the time, the Book of Margery Kempe is the earliest known autobiography in English. Margery Kempe lived in Lynn, a well-to-do town in East Anglia. She owned a horse mill at one time, ran a brewery, had 14 children, and later went on her travels. The book covers her life from her first pregnancy until her mid-60s. At its heart is the religious crisis that Margery experienced after the birth of her first child, when she had visions of devils who encouraged her to reject Christ and abandon her family, and then a vision of Christ asking why she had forsaken him. These visions were followed by conversations with Christ, God, and the Virgin Mary, which cemented Margery's religious faith and sent her on her path as a mystic. Margery subsequently agreed with her husband that their marriage should be chaste so that she could devote herself to God. Slide that a bit. In the book, Margery describes the intensity of her religious experiences. When moved, she was prone to weeping and wailing, and talks about her lengthy pilgrimages. She also recounts her difficulties when she was accused of practices forbidden by the Catholic Church at the time, such as wearing white, a color reserved for nuns. Margery could not read or write, so she dictated her story to a number of scribes. The manuscript was complete by 1438 and was probably kept safe by monks, but then it went missing. In 1934, it was rediscovered in a country house and has since been translated into modern English and published. It is now prized as a unique, first-hand account of the life of a woman in the 15th century. Check that out. So neat. I like that. It says that Margery is referred to in the third person, which we're going to see in the quote down here. When she came into the churchyard of St. Stephen's, where a priest she knew had been buried, she cried, she roared, she wept, she fell down to the ground, so fervently did the fire of love burn in her heart. She had such holy thoughts and such holy memories that she could not control her weeping nor her crying, and therefore people were astonished at her, supposing that she had wept because of some fleshly or earthly affection, and said to her, "What is wrong with you, woman? Why are you behaving like this? We knew him as well as you." Then there were some priests in the same place who knew her way of behaving, and they made her welcome with much kindness. Next we have A Citizen's View. This is from 1450 to 1516, pen and ink on paper, 90 pages, and it's in Florentine. Luca Landucci, apothecary. In the 15th century, Florence was one of the largest, richest, and most cultured cities in Europe. It was the heart of the Italian Renaissance, and wealthy Florentines, particularly the Medici family, became patrons of the arts, commissioning work from great painters, sculptors, and architects. Observing all of this from his shop in central Florence was Luca Landucci, an apothecary who kept a remarkable diary. Landucci's diary begins in 1450, when he was just 14 years old, but the manner in which the entries whisk through the early years suggests that he began writing it many years later. Around 1578, his entries become more detailed and frequent, but by no means daily. Landucci may have been a humble shopkeeper, but he lived through momentous times and chronicled the history of the city as it unfurled. Much of what he wrote about were things he had seen himself, some of them quite extraordinary. He records the opening of Ghirlandaio's great frescoes in the Santa Maria Novella, the assassination attempt on Lorenzo de' Medici, and the rise of the fundamentalist monk Savonarola, including the bonfire of the Vanities, where his supporters collected and burned thousands of vain things. The diary records natural phenomena such as floods and eclipses, and also provides an eyewitness account of daily events. Landucci describes the works of artists, but he also attends hangings and dissections. A cross after the entry for March 19th, 1516 marks his death, but the entries continue until 1542, perhaps written by his son. A landmark among early diaries, this diary of an ordinary citizen provides a compelling insight into everyday life in Renaissance Florence. Check this out. Isn't that interesting? It says right here is a list of names of people who have been sentenced to death. Interesting. Let's read a quote from it. This is on May 14th, 1504. The marble giant, which is Michelangelo's David, was taken out of the opera, or the office of works of the Duomo, and they had to break down the wall above the door so that it could come through. During the night, stones were thrown at the giant to injure it. Therefore, it was necessary to keep a watch over it. It went very slowly, being bound in an erect position and suspended so that it did not touch the ground with its feet. It was moved along by more than 40 men. The said giant had been made by Michelangelo Buonarroti. That's pretty cool. Right. Should be able to recognize immediately. I know I did this handwriting and drawings. It is the Notebooks of a Genius, 1478 to 1519, pen and ink on paper, 6,000 pages in Italian. It is, of course, Leonardo da Vinci, artist and scientist. There we go. One of the greatest painters of all time, Leonardo da Vinci was a multi-talented genius of the Italian Renaissance. He left behind more than 6,000 pages of notes, which he probably made on loose sheets of paper that were later folded together and bound to make notebooks known as codices. These contained his observations, discoveries, and ideas in a vast array of fields ranging from physics, architecture, and engineering to anatomy and botany, packed with detailed scientific descriptions, diagrams, and stunning pen and ink drawings. The notebooks are unique because Leonardo was not just a phenomenal artist, but also an innovative scientist and a painstaking observer. Each sheet of paper is tidily covered with an elaborate hodgepodge of text and images, ideas and inventions. In the 15th century, most scientists relied on the opinions of ancient writers, but Leonardo preferred the evidence of his own eyes. Leonardo began to jot down his thoughts and observations from about 1478 and kept his notebooks until the end of his life. During this time, he was working as an artist, architect, and military and naval engineer for a series of rich and powerful patrons, the Duke of Milan, the Medici family in Florence, and Francois I of France. Some of the entries in the notebooks, such as city plans for Milan or diagrams for sculptures and elaborate devices, are closely linked to the interests of his patrons. Others are whimsical studies that helped Leonardo perfect his paintings or develop an idea. There is some evidence that Leonardo was preparing the notebooks for publication toward the end of his life. After his death, a pupil gathered his notes together, but some of the material, including many of the pages on painting, were later lost. No one took much notice of what had survived. The notebooks were not taken up by other scientists because Leonardo had trained as an artist and had not had a scientific education. By the 20th century, the notebooks had been scattered around the world, ending up in collections in Europe and the US. They have also been published and translated, and readers today still marvel at the enormous range of Leonardo's writings and how advanced his thinking was. Let's read a selection down here. If I can slide the book over. There we go. Many will think that they can with reason blame me, alleging that my proofs are contrary to the authority of certain men held in great reverence by their inexperienced judgments, not considering that my works are the issue of simple and plain experience, which is the true mistress. These rules enable you to know the true from the false, and this induces men to look only for the things that are possible and with due moderation, and they forbid you to use a cloak of ignorance, which will bring about that you attain to no result, and in despair abandon yourself to melancholy. Experience has been the mistress of all who have written well, so as mistress I will cite her in all cases. That's incredible. Let's read a little bit more in detail. Leonardo was interested in a huge number of subjects. I'm adjusting my chair. During the Renaissance, people believed that it was possible for one person to excel in every field of knowledge, and Leonardo came close to achieving this. He jotted down notes and diagrams on subjects as diverse as geometry, mathematics, geology, flight, music, and military engineering. He also made major advances in the study of water, astronomy, and anatomy. Some of his work, such as the plans for cities or fortifications, or his designs for crossbows or water fountains, would have been useful to his wealthy patrons. Among the other inventions were contraptions such as a helicopter, a flying machine with flapping wings, and a parachute, ideas so far ahead of their time that they were still challenging inventors 400 years later. The notebooks reveal not just the scope of Leonardo's knowledge and his questioning scientific mind, but also personal details. The list of his clothes, for example, shows his liking for pink tights. The extent of his private research also helps explain why, although he was a great artist, he produced relatively few paintings and took years to finish some of them. Isn't that incredible? He had such an eye for detail on everything. And if you look carefully at the words here, he's writing backwards. He's doing mirror writing. So like he's making all of these intense observations, but writing it backwards. Isn't that? I mean, that's what geniuses do, right? Alright. let's read this little directory. Other small little mentions. This is the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, Roman, circa 170 CE. Born into a prominent Roman family as Marcus Annius Verus in 121 CE, the author of the celebrated Meditations took the name Marcus Aurelius on becoming Roman Emperor in 161 CE. He is known as the last of the 5 good emperors, providing principled leadership to an empire ravaged by plague and menaced by the incursions of barbarian tribes. It was chiefly while leading his army on campaigns against Rome's enemies on the frontier with the Danube River that Marcus Aurelius jotted down the intimate notes that were later gathered into the 12 books of his Meditations. Written in Koine Greek, the language commonly used in the Roman Empire, he expressed a personal worldview based on the philosophy of the ancient Greek Stoics. In epigrammic style, he urges himself never to forget the brevity and cosmic insignificance of human life, and the need to check desire and extinguish appetite, and pursue a high standard of personal conduct. The emperor's private reflections were rediscovered almost 1,000 years after his death, and were recognized as providing a unique insight into the ancient world. And next, we have the Risala of Ahmed ibn Fadlan. It's in Arabian, 921 to 922 CE. In 921 CE, Caliph al-Muqtadir, ruler of the Muslim Abbasid Empire, sent an embassy to the Bulgars who lived on the Volga River. Ahmad ibn Fadlan, an expert in Islamic law and theology, traveled with the expedition, which journeyed from the Abbasid capital, Baghdad, across Central Asia into what is now Russia. The Risala, meaning message in Arabic, is his personal account of the marvels that he witnessed on a trip that covered 2,500 miles, or 4,000 kilometers. His narrative is best known for its graphic account of the customs of the Rus, Scandinavian Vikings who ran the trade route along the Volga. Ahmed was astounded by their physical strength, their tattoos, and their poor personal hygiene. His lurid account of a Viking ship funeral is justly famous. Only fragments of the Risala were known until a complete text was discovered in 1923. Next is the Pillow Book of Sei Shonagon. It's in Japanese, circa 993 to circa 1002 CE. Born into a family of scholars and poets, Sei Shonagon served as a lady-in-waiting to the Empress Teishi at the Japanese imperial court in Kyoto during the Heian era. For her own pleasure, she kept a journal of her daily life at court, recording her thoughts, feelings, and observations. Written in the Japanese hiragana symbols rather than the Chinese characters used at the time by male Japanese authors, the Pillow Book offers a charming mix of gossip, anecdotes of court life, reminiscences, personal reflections, sensitive descriptions of nature, and idiosyncratic lists of unsuitable things, elegant things, things that irritate me, and things that make me fondly recall the past. Shonagon wrote of never intending these notes to be seen, but even in her lifetime her journal was read and admired in court circles. Spontaneous and sophisticated, it has since come to be regarded as one of the finest Japanese literary works of its era. Here's the Safarnama, the Safarnama of Nasir Khusraw. It's in Persian from 1046 to 1052. The renowned Persian philosopher and poet Nasir Khusraw was born in Khorasan, eastern Iran, in 1004 CE. He worked as a government official until about the age of 40, when, by his own account, a vision in a dream impelled him to travel in search of spiritual enlightenment. He He traveled for 7 years, making the pilgrimage to Mecca, but also visiting a wide area of the Muslim world, from Central Asia to Syria, Jerusalem, the Arabian Desert, and Cairo. During his travels, he kept a journal, recording the political and social state of each country, the buildings of its cities, and his conversations with local people, from shopkeepers to scholars. When he returned to Khorasan, he used his notes as the basis for the Safarnama book of travel, which is both an exemplary work of Persian literature and an invaluable source of information for historians. Having embraced the Ismaili branch of Shia Islam in old age, Khusra was driven from Khorasan by Sunni Muslims and died in exile in 1088. The Diary of Ibn al-Bana, it's Iraqi, 1068 to 1069. One of the earliest known diaries in the Muslim world was written by Ibn al-Bana, a prominent scholar and teacher who lived in Baghdad, the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate. A fragment of the journal in Ibn al-Bana's own handwriting, which has survived and is preserved in a library in Damascus, Syria, covers 14 lunar months of the Islamic years, 460 to 461, equivalent to the period from August 1068 to September 1069 in the Christian calendar. Ibn al-Bana's diary mainly offers personal observations on events in the political and academic life of Baghdad, along with accounts of miracles and wonders of which he had heard. It includes interpretations of more than 20 dreams, experienced either by Ibn al-Bana himself or by members of his family or friends. There are also obituaries of prominent figures of the day who died while he was keeping the diary. Ibn al-Bana may have kept the diary as a source of material for a scholarly chronicle of his times that he planned to write. And next is the Revelation of Julian of Norwich. It's in English, circa 1373. The Revelations of Divine Love were written by a Christian anchoress, or a type of hermit, who lived in a cell beside the Church of St. Julian in the English city of Norwich, and who is hence known as Julian of Norwich. Born around 1343, the anchoress fell gravely ill at the age of 30 and was being administered the last rites when she experienced the first of 16 shewings of the Passion of Christ, vivid religious visions that effected a miraculous cure. Immediately after her recovery, Julian wrote a short account of the visions showed by the goodness of God to a devout woman. Some 30 years later, she completed a much longer form of the text, elaborating on her mystical experience. Both versions of her revelations were written in English, the common spoken language of the day, rather than the learned language of Latin, and have survived thanks to manuscript copies made in the century following Julian's death in 1416. The short text was rediscovered only in 1911. Admired as devotional writing, the Revelations are of historic importance as the first English book written by a woman. That interesting. Rooster thinks so too. Next is the Diaries of Gregorio Dotti in Florentine, circa 1385 to 1427. Gregorio Dotti was a silk merchant who lived in the city-state of Florence in the early Renaissance. He kept diaries primarily as a record of his business transactions. Married 4 times and the father of 26 children, he writes about his family affairs in the same tone that he uses for his business, emphasizing the size of dowry that he received for each marriage, which he used as capital for commercial ventures and to pay off his debts. I think that a little bit. There we go. One of Dotti's diaries, the Libro Segreto, or Secret Book, gives more insight into his personal psychology, recording the self-denying resolutions that he made to remain chaste on Fridays, for example, as he struggled to reconcile Christian morality with self-interest and social ambition. The precariousness of life at the time is well conveyed by Doughty's record of bankruptcies, losses due to piracy at sea, and sudden death. 3 of his children died in a single day during the plague of 1420. It's awful. Doughty was also prominent in city government and wrote a notable history of Florence. Next is the Journal d'un bourgeois de Paris, in French, 1409 to 1449. Despite its customary French title, modern research has established that this anonymous journal of Parisian life in the 15th century was not the work of a bourgeois, an ordinary citizen or burgher, but of some unidentified priest linked to the University of Paris and the Cathedral of Notre Dame. Written during a troubled period of the 100 Years' War, when France was riven by civil conflict and partially occupied by English armies, the diary chronicles public events and everyday life, often in vivid detail. Its graphic accounts of mass burials in the plague of 1418, or starving children begging in the streets during the famine of 1420, are clearly the work of an eyewitness. Other elements of the journal, such as its references to the trial of Joan of Arc in 1431, are interesting as they provide a picture of what was rumored or believed by people at the time. The journal is known from manuscript copies made in the 15th and 16th centuries. The first complete printed version appeared in 1729. And lastly, we have the record of Chobu. It's in Korean from 1488. A record of drifting across the southern Brocade Sea, known in Korean as Gunam Pyoherok. I don't know how that's supposed to be pronounced. Anyway, is an account of an unplanned visit to China by an official of Korea's Joseon dynasty. Sailing for Korea from an offshore island in February 1488, Chobu and his party were blown off course during a violent storm and eventually washed ashore on the Chinese coast near Ningbo. The Chinese authorities escorted the Koreans on a 49-day trip along the Grand Canal to Beijing, the capital of the Ming Empire. From there, they returned to Korea by road, reaching the border in July. Chobu kept detailed notes during this eventful journey, observing many fascinating and previously unknown details of Ming commerce, society, laws, and customs. After he had returned to Korea, at the request of the Korean king Seonjong, he wrote up his travel journal in literary Chinese, the language that was used by scholars and the elite. A printed edition of the work had already become well known by the 16th century. Today it is regarded as an outstanding eyewitness account of Ming-era China. Alright, that's where we'll leave off for tonight. We'll continue later on with more interesting first-hand accounts and diaries. Thank you so much for watching. I hope that you found this video relaxing and educational. And I hope that you have a very good